Hello, and welcome back to Best Sleep History. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Go ahead and settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself relax. Tonight, we're going on an extra-long journey through history. Over 2 hours of fascinating stories about love, daily life, strange customs, and the human experience across ancient civilizations. We'll start with the bizarre and romantic world of ancient dating and courtship. Then we'll explore what daily life was really like for ordinary people in the ancient world. Discover some of the strangest jobs that actually existed, and finish with fascinating stories about ancient entertainment and leisure. So take a deep breath, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's step back in time together for a long, relaxing journey through history. Let's start in ancient Egypt, where love and marriage were surprisingly modern in some ways, and completely foreign in others. Here's something that might surprise you. Ancient Egyptians married for love. Unlike many ancient cultures where marriages were purely political or economic arrangements, Egyptian couples often chose each other based on genuine affection. We have love poetry from ancient Egypt that sounds like it could have been written yesterday. One poem from around 1300 BCE reads, "My heart remembers well your love. Half of my temple is combed, but I go off rushing. When I find my beloved, I'll comb the other half." Can you imagine? 3,000 years ago, someone was so excited to see their crush that they literally ran out with half their hair done. That's relatable. Young Egyptians had remarkable freedom compared to other ancient cultures. They could meet at festivals, in markets, or along the Nile. Courtship involved gifts, flowers, jewelry, perfumes. Men would write love letters on pottery shards. Women would respond with poems of their own. But here's where it gets interesting. Egyptian courtship also involved some practical magic. Love spells were common. Not evil curses, but hopeful charms meant to attract someone's attention or ensure their faithfulness. One spell instructed a woman to write her beloved's name on a piece of linen, tie it to a live scarab beetle, whisper her wish to the beetle, then release it. As the beetle flew away, it would supposedly carry her message to the gods, who would arrange the match. Marriage itself was remarkably straightforward. There was no big ceremony, no religious ritual required. A couple simply agreed to live together, moved their belongings into shared quarters, and that was it. They were married. Women in Egypt had considerable rights. They could own property, initiate divorce, and keep their own wealth. Divorce was also simple and non-stigmatized. If a couple couldn't get along, they separated, divided their property, and that was that. Now let's travel to ancient Rome, where love and marriage were considerably more complicated and often much less romantic. Roman marriage, especially among the upper classes, was primarily a political and economic arrangement. Fathers chose their children's spouses to forge alliances, consolidate wealth, or gain political advantage. Girls could be legally married as young as 12, though marriages were often arranged years before that. A father had complete authority over whom his daughter married. But here's where Roman courtship gets truly strange. There was an old tradition of marriage by capture, literally kidnapping women as a form of courtship. The legend goes that early Rome had a severe shortage of women. So Romulus, Rome's founder, invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, and during the celebration, Roman men grabbed Sabine women and carried them off to be wives. By the classical period, actual kidnapping marriages were illegal, but the tradition survived symbolically. Roman wedding ceremonies included a ritual where the groom would abduct his bride, lifting her over the threshold while she playfully resisted. Roman men, especially upper-class ones, often had mistresses and visited prostitutes. This was socially accepted. Women, however, were expected to remain faithful. Still, there are touching examples of genuine Roman love. Pliny the Younger wrote beautiful letters to his wife Calpurnia. "I take up your letters," he wrote, "and I imagine I am holding you." Ancient Greece presents a complex picture of love and sexuality that doesn't fit neatly into modern categories. Athenian women, especially from respectable families, lived largely secluded lives. They spent most of their time in the women's quarters of the house, separated from the male-dominated public world. Girls were typically married around age 14 or 15 to men in their late 20s or 30s. They had no say in choosing their husbands. The marriage was arranged by their fathers. The bride wouldn't have known her groom well, if at all, before the wedding. Courtship, as we understand it, didn't exist for respectable Athenian women. After marriage, an Athenian wife's job was to manage the household and produce legitimate heirs. Her husband would spend his time in the agora, at the gymnasium, at political meetings. For emotional and intellectual companionship, Athenian men turned to symposiums, drinking parties where men reclined on couches, drank wine, and discussed philosophy. Women weren't invited, except for entertainers called hetairae. Hetairae were educated courtesans, skilled in music, conversation, and wit. The most famous was Aspasia, who became the partner of Pericles, Athens' greatest leader. She hosted a salon where philosophers gathered and influenced political thought. Relationships between adult men and adolescent boys were common and socially acceptable in many Greek cities. These were educational mentorships with a romantic and sexual component. Both men were expected to eventually marry women and have families. Let's sail north now to Viking Scandinavia, where courtship and marriage were surprisingly practical and remarkably equitable. Viking courtship involved negotiation between families. The woman's consent was legally required. She could refuse a proposal, and her refusal was binding. Viking marriages were partnerships. Women managed the household and farm while men were away. They held keys to the family's storehouses and controlled the household economy. Women could own property, inherit wealth, and initiate divorce relatively easily. If a Viking woman wanted to divorce her husband, she could call witnesses and declare she was divorcing him. Acceptable reasons included: her husband was a poor provider, he had been unfaithful, he had struck her, or, and this is my favorite, he wore clothing that was too revealing. Yes, there's a recorded case of a Viking woman divorcing her husband because he wore a shirt with too low of a neckline. Upon divorce, the woman took her dowry, half the household goods, and often kept the children. Divorced women could remarry without stigma. Medieval Europe had two contradictory ideas about love: arranged marriage for practical purposes, and courtly love as romantic ideal. Among the nobility, marriage was entirely political. Royal and noble marriages forged alliances, ended wars, consolidated territory. Young nobles might be betrothed as children and married as teenagers to people they'd never met. But then there was courtly love, a literary and social phenomenon. A knight would choose a lady, usually someone else's wife, and declare himself her devoted servant. He would perform great deeds in her honor and worship her from afar. The relationship was supposed to be chaste. The lady was unattainable, which made her more desirable. Courtly love became enormously influential, shaping literature and art for centuries. It's where we get the romantic ideal of love as ennobling. In traditional Chinese culture, marriage wasn't about the couple. It was about the families. The purpose was to produce sons who would continue the family line and honor the ancestors. Marriages were arranged by parents with the help of professional matchmakers. The process was elaborate, involving fortune tellers analyzing birth dates to determine compatibility. Throughout this entire process, the bride and groom typically never met. They weren't supposed to see each other until the wedding day. Foot binding was intimately connected to marriage prospects. Young girls would have their feet tightly bound, breaking the arch and curling the toes. The process was excruciating, but bound feet were considered essential for making a good marriage. Once married, a Chinese wife moved in with her husband's family, where she was at the bottom of the household hierarchy. Her status would only improve if she produced sons. Sparta was a warrior society. Everything, including marriage, served the goal of producing the best soldiers. Spartan courtship was brief and strange. On the wedding night, the bride would have her head shaved and be dressed in men's clothing. The groom would abduct her and carry her to a dark room. They would consummate the marriage quickly, and then the groom would return to the military barracks. He wasn't allowed to live with his wife. Instead, he'd visit her secretly at night, sneaking away from the barracks. This would continue for years. Some Spartan men reportedly fathered children without ever seeing their wives in daylight. Spartan women, left alone to manage households, developed considerable independence and authority. They were known throughout Greece for their boldness and sharp tongues. Now let's spend time in ancient Rome, discovering what daily life was actually like for ordinary people. Imagine waking up in a Roman insula, a multi-story apartment building where most urban Romans lived. You're on the third floor in a small room barely furnished. There's your bed, a simple wooden frame with a straw mattress, maybe a small table, a chair, an oil lamp. Your room has no running water, no bathroom, no kitchen. For water, you'll visit the public fountain. For the bathroom, there's a communal latrine downstairs, or chamber pots that get emptied into the street. Yes, people would literally dump waste out of windows into the streets below. Walking under apartment windows in Rome was hazardous. It's still dark, but the city is already waking up. You can hear carts rumbling, delivery carts bringing goods, because wheeled traffic is banned during daylight to reduce congestion. Romans don't eat a big breakfast. Maybe some bread dipped in wine, perhaps some cheese or olives. Most people eat quickly and leave for work. As you head out, Rome assaults your senses. Over 1 million people live in the city. The streets are narrow, winding, often unpaved in poor neighborhoods. They smell of sewage, animals, cooking fires. Street vendors are everywhere, shouting about their wares. Fresh fish, bread, wine. The noise is overwhelming. Romans complained constantly about how loud their city was. In the afternoon, Romans head to the public baths. These weren't just for bathing. They were social clubs, gyms, meeting places, and entertainment centers. The bathing process follows a specific routine. First, the warm room to acclimate. Then the hot room, where you sit in steamy air, sweating. An attendant scrapes your skin with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing sweat, oil, and dirt. Romans don't use soap. They use oil and scraping. Next, you dip in the hot pool, heated by hypocaust systems, underground furnaces that heat the floors and walls. Finally, you plunge into a cold pool. The baths also have exercise areas, libraries, gardens, and snack bars. You might spend hours here, chatting with friends, conducting business, hearing gossip. As evening approaches, you head home for dinner, the main meal of the day. For most Romans, dinner is simple: bread, porridge, vegetables, maybe some fish or meat. Romans recline while eating, lying on couches, arranged around a table. Wine is essential. Romans drink wine mixed with water at every meal. After dinner, you might attend entertainment. Theater performances, gladiator fights, chariot races at the Circus Maximus. Or you might just spend the evening at home, talking with family, playing games. As night falls, Rome becomes dangerous. There's no street lighting. The streets are dark and full of hazards. Criminals operate more brazenly. If you're smart, you stay inside after dark. You return to your insula and settle in for sleep. The noise never really stops. Carts continue delivering goods, drunks stumble home. The city breathes even in darkness. Now let's explore the strangest, most unusual jobs that people actually did in the ancient world. Fullers were ancient laundry workers in Rome, but their methods were disgusting. They used urine to clean clothes. Yes, human and animal urine, collected from public urinals placed around the city specifically for this purpose. Romans would relieve themselves in these urinals, and fullers would collect the urine. Why? Because urine contains ammonia, an effective cleaning agent. Fullers would soak dirty clothes in large vats of stale urine mixed with water, then stomp on them with their bare feet. After the urine wash, they'd rinse the clothes, then treat them with fuller's earth, a type of clay that absorbed oils and dirt. The job was smelly, disgusting, and low status, but essential. Emperor Vespasian famously taxed public urinals, and when his son complained, Vespasian held up a gold coin and said, "Money doesn't smell." The Vestal Virgins were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Their primary job was to keep the sacred fire burning in her temple. If it went out, disaster would supposedly befall Rome. Girls were chosen between ages 6 and 10 and served for 30 years. The job came with remarkable privileges. Vestals could own property, make wills, and had front-row seats at public games. But Vestals had to remain virgins for their entire service. Breaking this vow was catastrophic. The punishment was horrific: burial alive. The Romans believed they couldn't directly kill a Vestal, so they would seal her in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water and leave her to die. Her alleged lover would be publicly flogged to death. The consequences were so severe that accusations of unchastity were rare and taken extremely seriously. In ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, wealthy families would hire professional mourners to attend funerals and wail dramatically. The louder and more theatrical the mourning, the more respect shown to the deceased. These weren't family members. They were paid performers who specialized in looking grief-stricken. They would tear their clothes, pull their hair, beat their breasts, and cry loudly throughout the funeral procession. In Egypt, professional mourners were often women who would cover themselves in dust, throw dirt on their heads, and keen in specific ritualized patterns. They knew exactly how to perform grief to meet cultural expectations. Some became quite skilled at their craft, commanded good fees, and were in high demand for important funerals. It was considered shameful to have a quiet funeral with little mourning. It suggested the deceased wasn't loved or respected. Being a food taster for a Roman emperor or wealthy aristocrat sounds like it might be pleasant. You get to eat fancy food all day. But it was actually one of the most dangerous jobs imaginable. Your job was simple: taste everything before your employer ate it, to make sure it wasn't poisoned. If the food was poisoned, you'd die, but you'd save your employer's life. Poisoning was a real concern in ancient Rome. Political enemies, ambitious family members, and rivals used poison frequently. Some poisons acted quickly, causing immediate symptoms. Others were slower, more subtle. Food tasters were usually slaves, chosen for their loyalty or simply their expendability. Some emperors had multiple tasters, each trying different dishes. Paranoid emperors might wait hours after the taster ate to see if symptoms developed. The job came with decent food and living conditions, but the constant risk of death made it one of the most stressful positions imaginable. You literally never knew if your next bite might be your last. Medieval and ancient cities had a serious sewage problem. Chamber pots and privies needed to be emptied, and someone had to do it. Enter the gong farmers, men who collected human waste from privies and cesspits. They worked at night, removing the accumulated filth and hauling it away, usually to dump outside city walls or sell as fertilizer for fields. The work was disgusting and dangerous. The cesspits could be deep, and men sometimes fell in and drowned in sewage. The gases from decomposing waste could be toxic. The smell was overwhelming. Gong farmers were paid relatively well for their time because almost nobody wanted to do this work. They were also often required to live in certain areas, segregated from the general population because of the smell that clung to them. Despite the horrific nature of the work, it was essential. Without gong farmers, cities would become uninhabitable cesspools. They performed a necessary service, even if society treated them as untouchables. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, royal princes couldn't be physically punished. Their bodies were considered sacred, but they still needed discipline when they misbehaved. The solution? The whipping boy. A companion, usually of noble birth, was assigned to the prince. When the prince misbehaved, the whipping boy was punished instead, usually through physical beating. The theory was that the prince would feel guilty watching his friend suffer for his mistakes and would behave better to spare his companion pain. Did it work? Sometimes. Many princes did develop genuine affection for their whipping boys, who became close companions and advisors. Some whipping boys later received positions of power and influence when their princes became kings. But it was still a bizarre job, being paid to be someone's friend and get beaten when they misbehaved. The psychological dynamics must have been strange for both parties. At Delphi in ancient Greece, the oracle was one of the most important religious figures in the Mediterranean world. Kings, generals, and common people would travel to ask the oracle questions about the future. The oracle was always a woman, called the Pythia. She would sit on a tripod over a chasm in the earth, supposedly breathing in vapors that induced a trance state. In this altered state, she would deliver prophecies. The prophecies were usually cryptic and ambiguous. They required interpretation by priests, who would translate the Pythia's utterances into advice for the questioner. Modern scholars believe the Pythia might have been inhaling ethylene gas, seeping from geological formations beneath the temple. Ethylene can produce euphoria and dissociation, which would explain the trance states. Being the Pythia was prestigious, but demanding. You had to maintain ritual purity, live separately from men, and spend significant time in trance states that might have been physically and mentally taxing. The Oracle of Delphi influenced major historical events. Wars were started or avoided based on her prophecies. Colonies were founded where she suggested. For centuries, she was one of the most powerful people in Greece, even though she was technically just a spokesperson for the god Apollo. Now let's explore how ancient people entertained themselves when they weren't working. You might be surprised by how much leisure time and entertainment ancient civilizations valued. Everyone knows about gladiators, but the reality was more complex than movies show. Gladiatorial games were huge public spectacles, but they weren't mindless bloodbaths. Gladiators were trained professionals, often slaves or prisoners, but some were volunteers who fought for money and fame. They trained in special schools, learning specific fighting styles and using particular weapons. There were different types of gladiators. The Murmillo wore a helmet with a fish crest and carried a sword and large shield. The Retiarius used a net and trident, wearing minimal armor. The Thraex had a small shield and curved sword. Each type had advantages and disadvantages, and fights were often matchups between complementary styles. Contrary to popular belief, not every fight ended in death. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain. Killing them wastefully was bad business. Many fights ended with one fighter yielding, and the crowd and sponsor would decide whether he lived or died. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture probably didn't exist as we imagine it. The actual gesture for death might have been a thumb across the throat or a closed fist. Successful gladiators could become celebrities. Women wrote graffiti about handsome gladiators. Children played with toy gladiator figurines. Some gladiators earned enough to buy their freedom and retire wealthy. But make no mistake, it was still brutal, dangerous work. Many gladiators died young, killed in the arena or from injuries sustained during fights. Ancient Greeks invented theater as we know it, and they took it seriously. Theater wasn't just entertainment. It was religious ritual, civic duty, and artistic expression. The major theater festival was the city Dionysia in Athens, held each spring in honor of Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy. For several days, the city essentially stopped working. Citizens would gather in the massive outdoor theater, which could hold up to 17,000 people. Playwrights would compete by presenting trilogies of tragedies, followed by a comedic satyr play. Judges would award prizes for Best Tragedy, Best Comedy, and Best Actor. The tragedies dealt with serious themes: fate, hubris, divine punishment, family duty. They featured heroes from mythology dealing with impossible choices and tragic consequences. Audiences would watch stories they knew. Everyone knew how Oedipus's story ended. But the dramatization and interpretation made familiar tales fresh and moving. Comedies were raunchy, political, and often obscene. Aristophanes wrote plays making fun of politicians, philosophers, and social trends. They featured sexual jokes, bodily functions, and slapstick humor. Ancient Greek comedy makes modern comedy look tame. All the actors were men, even for female roles. They wore masks that amplified their voices and indicated their characters' emotions. The masks were stylized, making them visible even from the back rows of the massive theater. Watching a Greek tragedy was a communal experience. Thousands of citizens watching together, experiencing catharsis, the emotional purification that came from witnessing suffering and resolution. It was entertainment, yes, but also a way of processing difficult emotions and exploring moral questions. Ancient Egyptians loved board games. The most popular was Senet, played for over 3,000 years. We've found Senet boards in tombs, including Tutankhamun's tomb, and paintings showing Egyptians playing it. The game used a board with 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. Players had pieces they moved according to throws of sticks or knuckle bones used as dice. The goal was to get all your pieces off the board before your opponent. But Senet wasn't just a game. It had religious significance. The game board was seen as a metaphor for the journey through the afterlife. The squares represented challenges the soul faced. Playing Senet was a way of contemplating death and the afterlife. Other Egyptian games included Mehen, played on a circular board shaped like a coiled snake, and Dogs and Jackals, which involved racing pieces around a palm tree-shaped board. Egyptians played these games during leisure time, at festivals, and in their homes. Game boards ranged from simple scratches in dirt to elaborate ivory and ebony sets inlaid with precious stones. Children played games too, versions of tag, tug of war, and games with balls and sticks. We found toy animals with movable parts, dolls, and spinning tops. Egyptian children's lives included play, just like children today. If you want to understand Roman passion for sports, you need to understand chariot racing. It was more popular than gladiatorial combat, more emotionally charged than theater, and generated more intense loyalty than anything else in Roman culture. Chariot races were held at the Circus Maximus, which could hold over 150,000 spectators, about 15% of Rome's entire population. That's like a modern stadium holding 50,000 people in a city of 350,000. 4 racing teams competed: the Reds, Blues, Greens, and Whites. Fans were fanatically loyal to their color. Riots sometimes broke out between fan groups. The Blues and Greens rivalry was so intense, it occasionally resulted in deaths. A race involved 12 chariots, 3 from each color, racing 7 laps around the track. The goal was to complete the laps fastest while avoiding crashes, and crashes were frequent. The track was narrow, and chariots jostled for position. Drivers would intentionally try to force opponents into the barrier wall or cause their wheels to tangle. When a chariot crashed, the driver could be dragged by the horses if he didn't cut himself free from the reins fast enough. Successful charioteers became superstars. They earned enormous sums, received gifts from fans, and were celebrated throughout the empire. One charioteer, Diocles, reportedly earned enough in his career to feed the entire city of Rome for a year. But the danger was real. Many charioteers died young, killed in crashes or from accumulated injuries. It was the most dangerous profession in Rome, and also one of the most glamorous. In ancient China, kite flying wasn't just a pleasant pastime. It had military, religious, and artistic significance. Kites were invented in China around 3,000 years ago. Early kites were made of silk stretched over bamboo frames. They were expensive and primarily used by the wealthy and military. Military applications included using kites to signal between units, measure distances to enemy positions, and even lift observers to spy on enemy camps. There are accounts of man-lifting kites being used in warfare. Religiously, kites were flown during festivals to honor ancestors and communicate with the heavens. Some kites were made in the shapes of dragons, butterflies, or birds, each carrying symbolic meaning. By the Tang Dynasty, kite flying had become popular entertainment. Competitions were held to see whose kite could fly highest, perform the best tricks, or be the most beautifully decorated. Kites became increasingly elaborate. Some had whistles that created sounds in the wind. Others were made to look like fantastic creatures from mythology. Master kite makers were respected artisans. Children flew simpler kites, learning the skill from their parents. Kite flying was a multi-generational activity with grandparents teaching grandchildren techniques passed down through families. We mentioned symposiums earlier when talking about Greek courtship, but let's explore them more deeply because they were central to Greek social and intellectual life. A symposium wasn't just a drinking party, though drinking was involved. It was a carefully orchestrated social event following specific rules and customs. After dinner, the symposium would begin. Participants, all men, would recline on couches arranged around the room. Wine would be mixed with water in a large bowl called a crater. Drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric. A symposiarch, master of ceremonies, would be chosen, usually by lot or contest. He decided the wine-to-water ratio and directed the evening's activities. Activities included drinking games with penalties for losing, musical performances on lyre or flute, poetry recitation, often improvised, philosophical discussions and debates, riddles and word games. Some symposiums featured entertainers, acrobats, dancers, musicians. The hetairai we mentioned earlier would often attend, providing intellectual companionship and sometimes sexual favors. But many symposiums were intellectual affairs. Plato's famous dialogue, The Symposium, records a philosophical discussion about the nature of love that supposedly took place at one such gathering. Whether it actually happened as recorded is debatable, but it shows how symposiums could be venues for serious thought. The symposium was where Greek men formed friendships, discussed politics, created poetry, and explored ideas. It was social networking, entertainment, and philosophy all combined. The Vikings had their own unique sports, and one of the most popular was narration, a ball game that combined elements of hockey, rugby, and outright brawling. The game was played with a hard ball and curved sticks on a field, usually ice or frozen ground. Two teams would compete to get the ball to the opposing goal. But unlike modern sports with strict rules about violence, narration actively encouraged physical combat. Players could tackle, trip, punch, and wrestle opponents. Injuries were common and expected. Sagas describe players breaking bones, losing teeth, and occasionally dying during matches. One saga tells of a player who was killed during a game, and his brother avenged him by killing the opponent who struck the fatal blow during the same game. Despite the violence, narration was considered good training for warriors. It developed teamwork, physical toughness, and the ability to fight while focused on an objective. Young boys learned the game as part of their education. Games could last for hours, with breaks for rest and sometimes for treating injuries. Spectators would gather to watch, cheering for their favored teams and placing bets on the outcome. The game had some rules. You couldn't use weapons other than the stick. You had to respect certain boundaries on the field, and there were referees of sorts, though their authority was limited and sometimes ignored in the heat of competition. Narration fell out of practice as Viking culture declined, but it shows how sports and warfare training were deeply connected in Viking society. Recreation doubled as military preparation. Now let's explore something that's both fascinating and sometimes horrifying: how ancient people understood and treated illness and injury. One of the oldest surgical procedures known to humanity is trepanning, drilling or scraping holes in the human skull. And remarkably, many patients survived. Archaeological evidence shows trepanning was practiced in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America as far back as the Neolithic period, over 7,000 years ago. We've found skulls with holes deliberately cut into them, and signs of bone healing around the edges, proving the patients survived the procedure. Why would ancient people drill holes in skulls? Several reasons. Some believed it released evil spirits causing mental illness or seizures. Others thought it relieved pressure from head injuries. Some cultures may have done it for ritual or spiritual purposes. The procedure involved using stone, bronze, or iron tools to carefully scrape or cut away a section of skull bone. The surgeon had to be skilled enough to penetrate the skull without damaging the brain tissue underneath. The survival rate was surprisingly high. Studies of ancient trepanned skulls show that 50 to 90% showed signs of healing, meaning patients lived days, weeks, or even years after the surgery. In the Inca Empire, trepanning was particularly advanced. Incan surgeons achieved survival rates that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the 19th century. They used bronze tools and possibly coca leaves as anesthetic. Some patients underwent multiple trepanning procedures throughout their lives. The practice continued into relatively recent times. In parts of Africa and Oceania, traditional healers performed trepanning into the 20th century. Modern medicine has found that in some cases, like depressed skull fractures causing pressure on the brain, trepanning could actually have been therapeutically beneficial. Ancient surgeons stumbled onto a procedure that sometimes worked, even if their understanding of why was incorrect. The ancient Egyptians were masters of preservation, and their embalming practices gave them detailed knowledge of human anatomy that contributed to their medical understanding. The embalming process was elaborate. First, embalmers would remove the brain through the nose using a long hook, scrambling it and pulling it out in pieces. They believed the brain was unimportant. They thought the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion. Next, they would make an incision in the side and remove the internal organs except for the heart. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were preserved separately in canopic jars. The heart was left in the body because it would be weighed in the afterlife. The body cavity was then cleaned and filled with natron, a naturally occurring salt that dried out the tissues. The body would be covered in natron and left to desiccate for 40 days. After drying, the body was wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Amulets and prayers were placed between the layers. The entire process took about 70 days. This intimate familiarity with human anatomy gave Egyptian doctors considerable knowledge. They understood that the heart pumped blood. They recognized that the pulse was connected to heart function. They knew the location of major organs. Egyptian medical papyri described treatments for various conditions. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and perform some surgeries. They used willow bark for pain, which contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. They used honey as an antibiotic. Honey actually does have antimicrobial properties. But Egyptian medicine also included magical elements. Spells and incantations were part of treatment. Some remedies involved ingredients like mouse tails or crocodile dung. Medical practice combined observation and reason with religious belief and superstition. Ancient Greek medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory dominated Western medicine for over 2,000 years. According to humoral theory, health resulted from the proper balance of these four fluids in the body. Illness occurred when the humors became imbalanced. Treatment involved restoring balance through diet, exercise, or direct intervention. Bloodletting was used to remove excess blood. Purging with laxatives expelled excess bile. Induced vomiting cleared excess phlegm. These treatments were based on the belief that removing the excess humor would restore health. The theory was completely wrong in terms of physiology, but it did encourage doctors to observe patients carefully and consider the whole person rather than just symptoms. Greek physicians took detailed case histories, noted environmental factors, and observed how diseases progressed. Hippocrates, the most famous Greek physician, emphasized observation and the natural healing power of the body. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts, describes many diseases accurately and recommends sensible treatments like rest, proper diet, and cleanliness. Greek doctors understood that exercise and diet affected health. They recognized the importance of cleanliness. They could set bones, treat wounds, and perform some surgeries. Some of their anatomical knowledge was surprisingly accurate. But they also believed in spontaneous generation of parasites, thought the brain was for cooling blood, and had limited understanding of infection. While Greek medicine focused on theory and individual treatment, the Romans excelled at public health and sanitation on a massive scale. Roman cities had aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant sources. Rome itself had 11 major aqueducts supplying hundreds of gallons per person per day, more than many modern cities provide. They built extensive sewer systems. The Cloaca Maxima in Rome, built in the 6th century BCE, is still partially in use today. Sewers carried waste away from living areas, reducing disease. Public baths weren't just for leisure. They were vital for public health. Regular bathing kept the population cleaner than most medieval Europeans would be 1,000 years later. Romans understood that swamps bred disease, though they didn't understand the mechanism of mosquito-borne illness. They drained swamps near cities and avoided building in marshy areas. The Roman army had sophisticated medical services. Each legion had medical personnel trained in treating wounds and injuries. They built hospitals called valetudinaria, where sick or wounded soldiers received care. Roman doctors performed remarkably advanced surgeries. They had specialized instruments for various procedures. They could remove cataracts, perform cesarean sections on deceased mothers to save babies, and amputate limbs. They used opium as an anesthetic and sedative. They understood the importance of washing wounds. Some doctors recognized that boiling water made it safer for treating injuries. But Roman medicine also had limitations. They didn't understand germ theory. They couldn't treat infectious diseases effectively. Many surgical patients died from infection, even when the surgery itself was successful. Chinese medicine developed along completely different lines from Western medicine, based on concepts of qi, life energy, yin and yang balance, and the 5 elements. Acupuncture, one of the most distinctive Chinese medical practices, involves inserting thin needles at specific points on the body to influence the flow of qi through meridians. The practice is at least 2,000 years old. From a Western perspective, the theoretical basis of acupuncture doesn't align with anatomical reality. The meridians don't correspond to any known physiological structures. Yet research has shown acupuncture can be effective for certain types of pain relief, possibly by triggering endorphin release or affecting nervous system function. Chinese doctors also developed herbal medicine to a sophisticated degree. The Chinese pharmacopoeia included thousands of herbs, minerals, and animal products used for various ailments. Some of these traditional remedies have proven medically valuable. Artemisinin, derived from sweet wormwood, is now a crucial anti-malarial drug. Chinese doctors were pioneers in recognizing deficiency diseases. They discovered that eating certain foods could prevent beriberi and other conditions, though they didn't understand the concept of vitamins. They practiced variolation, deliberately infecting people with mild cases of smallpox to provide immunity, centuries before Edward Jenner developed vaccination in the West. Chinese pulse diagnosis was remarkably sophisticated. Doctors believed they could diagnose a wide range of conditions by feeling the pulse at different points and depths, detecting subtle variations in rhythm, strength, and quality. Like all ancient medicine, Chinese practices mixed effective treatments with ineffective ones. But the holistic approach, considering the whole patient, their lifestyle, diet, and emotional state, was valuable even when the theoretical framework was incorrect. Indian Ayurvedic medicine, developed over 3,000 years ago, created one of the world's oldest comprehensive medical systems. Ayurveda is based on the concept of three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, constitutional types that influence health and personality. Treatment involves balancing the doshas through diet, herbs, and lifestyle changes. Ancient Indian surgeons were remarkably skilled. The Sushruta Samhita, a text from around 600 BCE, describes over 300 surgical procedures and 120 surgical instruments. Indian surgeons performed cataract surgery, plastic surgery, cesarean sections, and even early forms of rhinoplasty. Rhinoplasty, nose reconstruction, was developed because nose amputation was a common punishment for certain crimes. Surgeons would use skin from the forehead to reconstruct noses, a technique that wouldn't be replicated in Europe for centuries. Indian medicine also included sophisticated dental practices. Ancient Indian dentists performed extractions, treated cavities, and even made prosthetic teeth. The Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia was extensive, including thousands of plant-based remedies. Some have proven medically valuable: turmeric for inflammation, neem as an antimicrobial, ashwagandha as an adaptogen. Indian physicians emphasized prevention as much as cure. They advocated for daily routines that maintained health, including yoga, meditation, and proper diet. This preventive approach was more sophisticated than most ancient medical systems. Like other traditional medicines, Ayurveda mixed effective practices with ineffective ones. But its emphasis on holistic health, prevention, and the mind-body connection influenced medical thinking across Asia and eventually the world. Let's explore what ancient people actually ate and how they approached meals and dining. Romans were obsessed with a condiment called garum, a fermented fish sauce similar to modern Asian fish sauces. They put it on everything. Garum was made by layering fish, usually fatty fish like mackerel or anchovies, with salt in large vats and leaving them to ferment in the sun for several months. The fish would decompose, and the liquid that resulted was strained off and bottled. This sounds disgusting, but the result was a savory, umami-rich sauce high in protein and B vitamins. Romans used it the way we use salt, as a flavor enhancer added to almost every dish. Different grades of garum existed. The finest garum, called garum sotiorum, was extremely expensive. Some types cost more than perfume or fine wine. The best garum came from Spain and was traded throughout the empire. Romans mixed garum with wine, vinegar, oil, and herbs to create various sauces. They used it in cooking, as a table condiment, and even as a medicine. Feeling sick? Drink some garum mixed with wine. The smell during production was notoriously terrible, so garum factories were usually located outside city limits, downwind. The stench of fermenting fish was powerful enough that neighbors complained in court about nearby garum operations. Modern chefs who've recreated garum report that the finished product, when properly made, is actually quite delicious, salty, savory, and complex. It's not that different from modern fish sauce, which plays a similar role in Asian cuisines. Ancient Egyptians lived on bread and beer. These weren't treats or indulgences. They were the foundation of the Egyptian diet, consumed daily by everyone from pharaohs to laborers. Egyptian bread was made from emmer wheat, ground into flour using stone querns. The flour often contained bits of stone and sand from the grinding process, which wore down teeth. Egyptian mummies often show severe dental wear from eating gritty bread throughout their lives. Bread came in many varieties. Some were made with dates or honey for sweetness. Others contained herbs or seeds. The shape varied: round loaves, cone-shaped loaves, flat breads like pita. Bread could be baked in molds, on hot stones, or in clay ovens. Beer was made from partially baked barley bread that was crumbled into water and left to ferment. The result was thick, porridge-like, and nutritious, more like liquid bread than modern beer. It was consumed through straws to filter out the chunks. Egyptian beer was low in alcohol, around 2 to 3%. Everyone drank it: men, women, children. It was safer than water and provided calories and nutrition. Workers received beer rations as part of their pay. The brewing process was done by women, often in domestic settings. Larger breweries supplied temples, palaces, and workforce projects like pyramid building. Egyptians took their bread and beer seriously. The quality and quantity of these staples indicated social status. Gods received offerings of bread and beer. The dead were buried with bread and beer to sustain them in the afterlife. We talked about symposiums earlier as social events, but let's focus on what Greeks actually ate at these gatherings. The symposium followed dinner, so food wasn't the main focus, but small snacks and appetizers were served to accompany the wine. Common symposium foods included olives, nuts, dried figs and dates, cheese, flatbreads, and small savory pastries. Sometimes there were more substantial offerings like roasted meats, fish, or shellfish. The food was designed to be eaten while reclining, picked up with fingers, and eaten without utensils. Everything was bite-sized or easily torn into pieces. Greeks mixed their wine with water in specific ratios. The symposiarch would decide the proportion, typically 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric, something only Scythians and other non-Greeks did. The wine itself was stored in amphorae, large clay vessels. It might be flavored with honey, herbs, or spices. Sometimes it was cooled with snow brought down from mountains and stored in insulated pits. Between cups of wine, participants might eat a few olives or nuts to cleanse the palate. The point wasn't to fill up. It was to maintain the pleasant state of mild intoxication while engaging in conversation and entertainment. Vikings are known for their raids, but they also knew how to throw a feast. Viking feasts were major social events involving entire communities. The hall where feasts occurred was the center of Viking social life. The lord sat in a high seat, with honored guests arranged by rank along benches lining the walls. Lower status people sat farther from the lord. The main food at feasts was meat: roasted or boiled beef, pork, mutton, or game. Vikings didn't eat much poultry, but they did consume fish, especially preserved fish like dried cod. Stews were common, made with meat, vegetables, and grain, cooked in large cauldrons hanging over fires. Bread was baked, though it was denser and darker than modern bread, made from barley, rye, or oats. Dairy products were important. Vikings consumed milk, butter, and especially cheese, often made from sheep or goat milk. Skyr, a cultured dairy product similar to yogurt, was a staple. The feast would be accompanied by mead, fermented honey, or ale brewed from barley. Mead was prestigious and expensive. Ale was more common for everyday drinking. Drinking horns were used for mead and ale. These were actual cattle horns, polished and sometimes decorated, that held liquid. They couldn't be set down without spilling, so you had to drink the contents or pass the horn to someone else. Toasts were important parts of Viking feasts. The many memorial toasts to dead heroes and ancestors would be drunk solemnly. Boasting toasts where warriors proclaimed their accomplishments were also common. Entertainment included poetry and storytelling. Skalds, Viking poets, would recite poems celebrating the Lord and his ancestors, retelling legendary deeds, and composing new verses about recent events. Feasts could last all night, with drinking, eating, and storytelling continuing until people passed out or stumbled home. These gatherings reinforced social bonds, displayed wealth and generosity, and created shared cultural experiences. Chinese imperial banquets were extraordinarily elaborate affairs, with dozens or even hundreds of dishes served over many hours. The banquets displayed the emperor's wealth and power. Exotic ingredients from across the empire would be prepared by teams of specialized chefs. Presentation was as important as taste. Dishes might include bird's nest soup, shark fin soup, sea cucumber, abalone, whole roasted suckling pig, steamed fish, Peking duck, dumplings of every variety, noodles, rice dishes, and countless vegetable preparations. Ingredients were chosen for symbolic meaning as well as flavor. Dragon and phoenix motifs represented the emperor and empress. Noodles symbolized long life. Fish represented prosperity. Dishes were designed to bring good fortune. The banquet followed strict protocols. Seating arrangements reflected rank and status. Servants presented dishes in specific order. Guests waited for the emperor to taste each dish before eating themselves. Tea was served between courses to cleanse the palate. Sometimes entertainment would be provided. Acrobats, dancers, or musicians performing while guests ate. These banquets could last 6 to 8 hours, with breaks between courses for digestion and conversation. The goal wasn't just sustenance, but the creation of a complete aesthetic and social experience. For the average Chinese person, such extravagance was unimaginable. Their diet consisted mainly of rice or millet, vegetables, and occasionally a small amount of meat or fish. But knowing about imperial banquets, hearing descriptions, and perhaps catching glimpses during festivals added to the emperor's mystique and reinforced the social hierarchy. Finally, let's explore how ancient people traveled, what motivated them to journey to distant lands, and what those journeys were actually like. The Romans built over 250,000 miles of roads throughout their empire, and many are still in use today. These weren't just dirt paths. They were engineered structures designed to last. A typical Roman road had multiple layers. The bottom was a foundation of stones. Above that, smaller stones and gravel. Then crushed stone mixed with lime. Finally, large flat paving stones on top. The road would be slightly crowned in the middle for drainage, with ditches along the sides. These roads could handle heavy traffic and lasted for centuries with minimal maintenance. Some Roman roads in Italy and Britain are still carrying traffic 2,000 years later. The road system enabled rapid movement of armies, but it also facilitated trade, communication, and travel. A traveler could journey from Rome to Britain, knowing they'd find proper roads, bridges, and services along the way. The Romans built mansions, rest stops spaced about 15 to 20 miles apart, roughly a day's travel. These provided food, lodging, and fresh horses for official couriers and travelers who could afford them. For those who couldn't afford mansiones, there were more basic accommodations. Small inns and taverns lined the roads, offering simple food and sleeping arrangements. The quality varied widely. Some were comfortable, others were barely better than camping. Travel was slow by modern standards. On foot, you might cover 15 to 20 miles per day. On horseback or in a cart, perhaps 25 to 30 miles. A journey from Rome to Britain would take weeks. The roads were relatively safe within the empire, especially near major cities. Roman soldiers patrolled, and bandits faced severe punishment if caught. But in remote areas or during times of unrest, travelers hired bodyguards or joined merchant caravans for safety. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, but a network of trade routes connecting East Asia with the Mediterranean, stretching over 4,000 miles. Goods traveling the Silk Road changed hands many times. A Chinese silk merchant wouldn't travel to Rome. Instead, silk would pass through dozens of intermediaries: Central Asian traders, Persian merchants, Syrian dealers, each adding markup along the way. This made luxury goods extremely expensive by the time they reached their final destination. Roman elites paid enormous sums for Chinese silk, often not knowing where it came from or how it was made. Chinese emperors treasured Roman glass, equally ignorant of its origins. The journey was dangerous and difficult. Routes crossed some of the harshest terrain on Earth: the Taklamakan Desert, the Pamir Mountains, long stretches of Central Asian steppe. Travelers faced threats from bandits, harsh weather, lack of water, and difficult terrain. Caravans traveled in groups for safety, with armed guards protecting valuable goods. But the Silk Road also carried more than merchandise. Ideas, technologies, religions, and diseases all traveled these routes. Buddhism spread from India to China along the Silk Road. Paper-making technology moved from China westward. The bubonic plague likely traveled these routes too. Caravanserais, fortified rest stops, dotted the route, providing shelter, food, and security. Some were simple. Others were elaborate complexes with merchants' quarters, stables, warehouses, and even baths. The cultural exchange was profound. Cities along the route became cosmopolitan centers where Chinese merchants met Persian traders, where Buddhist monks encountered Zoroastrian priests, where different languages, customs, and ideas mingled. While Romans excelled at land travel, Phoenicians and Greeks were masters of the sea. Phoenician sailors from cities like Tyre and Sidon explored the Mediterranean and beyond. They established colonies and trading posts throughout the Mediterranean coast, in North Africa, Spain, and even possibly beyond the Straits of Gibraltar into the Atlantic. There's a controversial account by Herodotus of Phoenician sailors circumnavigating Africa around 600 BCE, commissioned by Egyptian pharaoh Necho Tsetu. The journey supposedly took 3 years, with sailors planting crops along the coast and waiting for harvest before continuing. Most historians were skeptical until Herodotus mentioned one detail that actually supports authenticity. The sailors reported that as they sailed around the southern cape of Africa, the sun appeared to the north. This would be true in the southern hemisphere, but would be counterintuitive to ancient Mediterranean sailors. It's the kind of confusing observation that suggests genuine experience rather than invention. Greek sailors explored extensively too. They colonized coasts around the Black Sea, throughout Sicily and southern Italy, and along the shores of the western Mediterranean. Greek and Phoenician ships were powered by both sails and oars. Triremes, warships with 3 rows of oars, could be quite fast, but were expensive to operate and required large crews. Merchant ships relied more on sails and were broader and slower, but could carry more cargo. Navigation was primitive by modern standards. Sailors used the sun and stars for orientation. They followed landmarks along coasts when possible. They knew prevailing winds and currents. Experience and skill were crucial. Master sailors were highly valued. Sea travel was dangerous. Storms could sink ships. Pirates operated in many areas. Ships avoided sailing in winter when storms were most frequent. The sailing season roughly ran from late spring to early fall, but the rewards of successful trading voyages were substantial. A merchant who survived could make a fortune. Cities that controlled maritime trade became wealthy and powerful. While Europeans wouldn't discover America until Columbus in 1492, Vikings actually reached North America around 1000 CE, nearly 500 years earlier. Norse sagas tell of Leif Erikson sailing west from Greenland and finding a land he called Vinland, where grapevines grew wild. Archaeological evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland proves Vikings established at least one settlement in North America. The Viking voyages to America weren't planned exploration. They were likely accidental discoveries while sailing between Iceland, Greenland, and Norway. A ship blown off course might discover new land. Vikings were extraordinary sailors. Their longships were clinker-built, overlapping planks creating a flexible hull that could handle rough seas. They were shallow-drafted, allowing them to sail up rivers and land on beaches. Viking navigation used the sun, stars, and observations of wildlife and water conditions. They may have used a sunstone, possibly a crystal that could locate the sun's position even through clouds by detecting polarized light, though this is debated. The settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows didn't last. Vikings encountered indigenous peoples, whom they called Skraelings. Relations were initially peaceful, but eventually turned hostile. Combined with the settlement's remoteness and difficulty of supply, Vikings abandoned Vinland after a few years. But the voyages proved that transoceanic travel was possible with Viking-age technology. The Vikings' achievement is remarkable, crossing the North Atlantic in open boats, establishing settlements in Greenland and briefly in North America, all without modern navigation tools. Now let's explore the reality of ancient warfare, how battles were actually fought, what weapons were used, and what life was like for ancient soldiers. The Greek phalanx was one of the most effective military formations in ancient history. It was a tight formation of heavily armed infantry, packed shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping. Each soldier, called a hoplite, carried a large round shield called a hoplon, weighing about 15 pounds. He wore a bronze helmet, breastplate, and greaves protecting his shins. His primary weapon was a spear about 8 feet long. In phalanx formation, hoplites stood in rows, typically 8 men deep. The front rank held their spears forward. The ranks behind pushed forward, adding weight and momentum to the formation. Your shield protected not just you, but also the man to your left. You depended completely on your neighbor's shield to protect your right side. Fighting in a phalanx was terrifying and exhausting. You couldn't see much through your helmet. The heat was intense. Bronze armor under the Mediterranean sun. The noise was deafening, metal clashing, men shouting, the wounded screaming. Battles often came down to which phalanx could maintain a formation longest. If your line broke, you were vulnerable. Individual heroics mattered less than collective discipline. The phalanx that stayed together, kept pushing forward, and maintained its cohesion usually won. Casualties in phalanx warfare were often surprisingly light for the victors, but devastating for the defeated. Once a phalanx broke and men started running, that's when most killing happened. Fleeing soldiers were cut down from behind. The phalanx required citizen soldiers who could afford their own armor. Wealthier citizens fought as hoplites. This created a political dynamic where those who fought for the city demanded political rights. The phalanx and Greek democracy evolved together. The Roman legion was a more flexible, sophisticated military organization than the Greek phalanx. Where Greeks fought in rigid formations, Romans could adapt to different terrain and enemies. A legion at full strength contained about 5,000 men, divided into centuries of 80 men each. Don't ask why a century had 80 men instead of 100. Historians aren't entirely sure either. Roman logic. The legion fought in multiple lines. The youngest, least experienced soldiers fought in front. Behind them were older, more experienced troops. The most veteran soldiers, the triarii, formed the final line, men who'd seen decades of service. There's a Roman saying, "It's come down to the triarii," meaning things have gotten serious. You're down to your last, best reserves. Each legionary carried a gladius, a short sword ideal for stabbing in close quarters, and 2 pila, weighted javelins. The pilum had a soft metal shaft designed to bend on impact. When thrown at an enemy shield, it would stick and bend, making the shield too heavy and awkward to use. The enemy had to discard his shield, leaving him vulnerable. In battle, Romans would throw their pila, then draw swords and advance. The multiple lines allowed fresh troops to cycle forward as frontline soldiers tired. This gave Roman armies staying power in prolonged battles. Roman discipline was legendary and brutal. Units that showed cowardice faced decimation. Every 10th man was killed by his fellow soldiers. This wasn't symbolic. Romans actually did this. The fear of decimation probably prevented more routes than the actual practice. But Romans also rewarded valor. Soldiers received bonuses for distinguished service. The first man over an enemy wall received a corona muralis, a crown awarded publicly. Veterans received land grants upon retirement. Combining harsh discipline with real rewards created an effective military culture. While Mediterranean civilizations fought with bronze and iron in close quarters, the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe perfected a different weapon, the composite bow. A composite bow was made from wood, horn, and sinew laminated together. Horn on the belly compressed when drawn. Sinew on the back stretched. Wood in the middle held it together. The result was a bow much more powerful than one made from wood alone, and crucially, it was short enough to use on horseback. Steppe nomads like the Scythians, Huns, and Mongols built their entire way of warfare around horse archery. They could ride at full gallop while shooting arrows with deadly accuracy. They used hit-and-run tactics, never committing to prolonged close combat. A horse archer might ride toward enemy lines, shooting arrows, then wheel away before the enemy could respond. They'd repeat this, wearing down opponents with arrows while staying mobile and difficult to pin down. The famous Mongol tactic was the feigned retreat. Horse archers would approach, shoot arrows, then appear to flee. As enemy forces broke formation to pursue, the Mongols would turn and annihilate the disordered pursuers. Many armies fell for this trick repeatedly. Composite bows had incredible range and power. A skilled archer could shoot accurately at 200 yards and hit targets at even greater distances. The force was enough to penetrate armor at close range. Creating a composite bow took a year or more. The materials had to be carefully prepared and cured. The bow needed time to settle after assembly. A good composite bow was expensive and valuable, passed down through families. Learning to shoot from horseback took years of practice starting in childhood. Steppe peoples grew up riding and shooting. This gave them a military advantage that settled civilizations struggled to counter. When steppe nomads invaded settled regions, like the Huns entering Europe or the Mongols conquering much of Asia, their horse archery overwhelmed traditional infantry and cavalry. It took centuries for settled civilizations to develop effective counters. Viking warriors were formidable, but some were legendary: the berserkers. These were warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, seemingly impervious to pain and fear. The word berserk comes from these warriors. It might mean bear shirt, suggesting they wore bearskins, or bare-shirted, meaning they fought without armor. Sources describe berserkers working themselves into a frenzy before battle, biting their shields, howling, and then attacking with wild abandon. In battle, berserkers supposedly felt no pain. They'd continue fighting even when seriously wounded. They showed no fear, charging into situations that would make normal warriors hesitate. What explains berserker behavior? Several theories exist. Some historians think they consumed substances, possibly mushrooms with psychoactive properties, or large amounts of alcohol, to induce altered states. Others suggest it was a form of self-hypnosis or battle trance achieved through ritual and psychological preparation. Another theory proposes that berserkers experienced a psychological state similar to modern battlefield dissociation, where extreme stress causes alterations in consciousness, reduced pain sensitivity, and tunnel vision. This can happen spontaneously in combat, or perhaps berserkers were simply marketing. Vikings understood psychological warfare. Having a reputation for invincible, crazy warriors would make enemies more likely to flee or surrender. Maybe berserkers weren't actually immune to pain. Maybe they were just very good at looking like they were. Whatever the truth, berserkers became legendary. They appear frequently in sagas and legends. Some berserkers supposedly served as royal bodyguards, their ferocity making them valuable protectors. The Mongols conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history, and they did it primarily through superior cavalry tactics and organization. A Mongol warrior had multiple horses, typically 4 or 5. This allowed them to travel vast distances quickly, switching to fresh mounts. Mongol armies could cover 60 miles in a day, far more than infantry armies. Each warrior carried 2 bows, a larger one for long-range shooting on foot, a smaller one for horseback archery. They had dozens of arrows with different types of heads, armor-piercing points, broad heads for unarmored targets, whistling arrows for signaling. Mongol tactics emphasized mobility and coordination. They used scouts extensively, gathering intelligence before engaging. They'd probe enemy positions, identify weak points, then concentrate force there. In battle, Mongols used the tumans, units of 10,000 men, divided into smaller units down to squads of 10. Commanders used flags and whistles to coordinate movements over vast battlefields. This organization allowed complex maneuvers that seemed chaotic to enemies, but were actually highly coordinated. The feigned retreat was a standard tactic. Mongol forces would attack, then retreat, drawing enemies into pursuing. Once enemy forces were disordered and separated from support, Mongols would turn and destroy them, Mongols also used psychological warfare effectively. They'd offer cities the choice to surrender peacefully or face complete destruction. Cities that resisted and were conquered would be massacred as an example, encouraging others to surrender. This reputation, whether fully deserved or exaggerated, made many cities surrender without fighting. Sieges were slow, brutal, and often decisive. A fortified city could hold out for months or even years against a larger army. Attackers had several options. They could try to take the city by storm, direct assault on the walls using ladders, siege towers, or battering rams. This was quick but costly in casualties. Defenders had every advantage. They could drop rocks, pour hot oil, shoot arrows from protected positions. Siege towers were mobile wooden structures, often several stories tall, that could be rolled up to city walls. Attackers inside the tower would be protected as they approached, then could fight defenders at the top of the wall on more equal terms. Battering rams were used to break through gates or walls. A large wooden beam, often with a metal head shaped like a ram's head, would be suspended on ropes or chains inside a wooden frame. Men would swing it back and forth, repeatedly striking the wall or gate until it broke. Undermining was another technique. Attackers would dig tunnels under the walls, supporting the tunnel with wooden beams. Once under the wall, they'd pile combustibles in the tunnel and set them on fire. The beams would burn away, the tunnel would collapse, and ideally the wall above would collapse too. Defenders could countermine, dig their own tunnels to intercept enemy tunnels. Underground battles in narrow tunnels were nightmarish, fighting in darkness, in confined spaces, with the constant fear of collapse. The most common siege tactic was simply waiting. Surround the city, cut off supplies, and wait for the inhabitants to run out of food. Starvation was a brutal but effective siege weapon. Life inside a besieged city was desperate. As food ran out, prices would skyrocket. People ate horses, dogs, rats, leather, anything. Disease spread in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Thirst could be as deadly as hunger if water supplies were compromised. Cities sometimes negotiated surrender terms. The inhabitants could leave safely if they opened the gates. Sometimes besieging armies would agree because a prolonged siege was expensive and risky. Disease could spread to the besiegers. A relief army might arrive. Weather could force the siege to be abandoned. But if a city was taken by storm after a long siege, the results were often horrific. Besieging soldiers, frustrated by months of hardship, would sack the city brutally. Massacres, looting, and destruction were common. Let's explore how ancient people understood the divine, practiced their faiths, and sought meaning through religion. Ancient Egyptians had one of the most complex religious systems in the ancient world, centered around the afterlife and the journey of the soul. Egyptians believed that humans had multiple spiritual components. The Ka was your life force. The Baye was your personality or soul. The Ak was the transformed, enlightened spirit you became after death, if all went well. Death wasn't the end. It was a transition to the afterlife, but you had to navigate it properly. After death, your soul would journey through the Duat, the underworld, facing various challenges and monsters. The most important moment was the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Two Truths, your heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, representing truth and justice. If your heart was heavy with sin, it would outweigh the feather. The monster Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, would devour your heart. and you'd cease to exist. But if your heart balanced with the feather, you passed into the field of reeds, a paradise that looked much like Egypt, but perfect. The Nile always flooded on time. Crops always flourished. You'd spend eternity in this pleasant afterlife, enjoying all the good things of life. This is why Egyptians mummified bodies and filled tombs with goods. You'd need your body in the afterlife. The grave goods, furniture, food, tools, servants, later replaced with servant statues called shabtis, would be needed in your afterlife. Egyptian religion had countless gods, often with overlapping roles. Ra was the sun god, creator of the world. Osiris was god of the underworld and judge of the dead. Isis was goddess of magic and motherhood. Anubis oversaw mummification. Different cities had different patron deities. Gods could merge. Ra and Amun became Amun-Ra, a supreme deity combining attributes of both. This flexibility and fluidity in Egyptian religion is distinctly different from monotheistic religions that would come later. Pharaohs were considered divine, gods on earth, intermediaries between humans and the divine realm. Their proper burial and continued cult worship after death was essential for maintaining cosmic order and Egypt's prosperity. Greek religion was less concerned with the afterlife than Egyptian religion, and more focused on proper relationships with the gods during life. Greeks believed in a pantheon of gods living on Mount Olympus. Zeus was king of the gods, god of sky and thunder. Hera was his wife, goddess of marriage. Poseidon ruled the seas. Hades ruled the underworld. Athena was goddess of wisdom and warfare. Apollo was god of music, poetry, and prophecy, and so on. Dozens of gods with different domains and personalities. These gods were powerful, but not all-powerful, and certainly not perfectly moral. Greek myths show gods being jealous, petty, lustful, and vengeful. They had favorites among humans and could be manipulated through proper sacrifice and flattery. Greek religious practice centered on sacrifice and offerings. You'd sacrifice animals to the gods, bulls, goats, sheep, burning portions for the gods, while the community ate the rest. This made religious festivals communal feasting occasions. Different gods required different offerings. Athena favored owls. Apollo liked cattle. Dionysus appreciated wine offerings. Proper ritual was important. You had to know which god to approach for which concern and how to approach them correctly. Temples were the homes of gods, not gathering places for worshippers. Rituals happened outside, at altars in front of temples. Inside the temple was the cult statue of the god, tended by priests. Ordinary people rarely entered the temple itself. Mystery cults offered initiates secret knowledge and promises of better afterlives. The Eleusinian mysteries, celebrating Demeter and Persephone, were the most famous. We don't know exactly what happened in these rituals. Initiates were sworn to secrecy, and they kept the secret so well that we still don't know the details thousands of years later. Greeks also consulted oracles for guidance. The oracle at Delphi was most famous, but oracles existed at other sites too. The gods, through their oracles, would answer questions about the future, though usually in cryptic ways that required interpretation. Greek religion was deeply woven into daily life. Every household had a shrine to household gods. Major decisions involved consulting omens, examining animal entrails, watching bird flights, interpreting dreams. The gods were present in every aspect of life. Romans were remarkably practical and flexible about religion. When they conquered new territories, they often adopted local gods, identifying them with Roman equivalents. The Roman pantheon was heavily influenced by Greek religion. Jupiter was Zeus. Juno was Hera. Neptune was Poseidon. Mars was Ares. The Romans borrowed freely, though. Their gods had somewhat different characters and roles. Romans emphasized duty and ritual correctness. Religion was about maintaining the pax deorum, peace with the gods. If you performed the proper rituals correctly, the gods would favor Rome. Religious practice was a civic duty more than a personal spiritual experience. Priests were often political officials. Being a priest was a public office, part of your career in Roman politics. Religion and state were inseparable. Romans also had practical magic and superstition. They used protective amulets, performed curses on enemies, and consulted fortune tellers. These practices existed alongside official state religion without much contradiction. The imperial cult added another layer. After Julius Caesar was declared divine after death, subsequent emperors claimed divinity. Worshipping the emperor or his genius, his divine spirit, became an expression of loyalty to Rome. This created problems when Christians refused to participate. Christians wouldn't worship the emperor or sacrifice to Roman gods. To Romans, this seemed like disloyalty to the state, not just religious difference. This is partly why Christians faced persecution, not primarily for their beliefs, but for their refusal to perform civic religious duties. Eventually, Christianity triumphed, becoming Rome's state religion under Constantine. The Roman tendency toward religious flexibility and syncretism helped Christianity spread. Christian theologians could argue that Christianity fulfilled and superseded pagan religion rather than simply contradicting it. Norse religion had a darker, more fatalistic worldview than Greek or Roman religion. The gods themselves were doomed. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was the prophesied end of the world. In this final battle, gods would fight the forces of chaos, giants, monsters, and the dead themselves. Most of the gods would die. The world would be destroyed by fire and flood, but after the destruction, the world would be reborn. A few gods would survive. 2 humans, sheltered in a tree during the destruction, would repopulate the earth. Life would begin again. This cyclical view of time, destruction, and renewal was distinctly different from linear concepts of history. The world had been created, would be destroyed, and would be created again. The major gods included Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and poetry. He sacrificed an eye for wisdom and hung himself from the world tree for 9 days to learn the runes. Thor was god of thunder, protector of humans, wielding his hammer Mjolnir. Loki was the trickster, sometimes helping the gods, sometimes causing trouble. Valhalla was Odin's hall, where warriors who died bravely in battle would feast and fight until Ragnarok. This made dying in battle honorable. You'd join the gods in Valhalla rather than going to Hell, the realm of inglorious death. But Norse religion was more than just warrior cult. Freya was goddess of love, fertility, and magic. Freyr brought prosperity and good harvests. Many gods had agricultural and domestic associations. Norse religious practices included sacrifices, animals, and possibly humans on occasion, though human sacrifice accounts are debated. Religious festivals marked seasonal changes and agricultural cycles. Seers and practitioners of Seder, a form of magic, could supposedly communicate with spirits and see the future. This was often practiced by women and had shamanic elements. When Christianity came to Scandinavia, conversion was gradual and sometimes superficial. Many Norse customs persisted alongside Christian practice. Some of our evidence for Norse mythology comes from Christian-era texts, written by people who were technically Christian, but still valued the old stories. Finally, let's explore the remarkable technological innovations of the ancient world, inventions that were far ahead of their time. The Romans invented a form of concrete that was, in some ways, superior to modern concrete. The Pantheon's dome, built around 125 CE, is still the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. After nearly 2,000 years, it's still standing and still in use. Roman concrete, called opus caementicium, was made from volcanic ash mixed with lime and seawater. The volcanic ash, pozzolana, came from deposits around Mount Vesuvius and other volcanic areas. The chemical reaction between the volcanic ash, lime, and seawater created an extremely durable material. Modern research has found that Roman concrete actually gets stronger over time when exposed to seawater, as minerals crystallize within the structure. This is why Roman harbors and breakwaters, submerged for 2 millennia, are still largely intact. Modern concrete deteriorates in seawater, but Roman concrete thrives in it. Romans used concrete for massive architectural projects. The Pantheon's dome spans 142 feet. The Colosseum used concrete extensively. Aqueducts, harbors, roads, bridges, concrete was everywhere in Roman construction. The dome construction technique was sophisticated. Romans used different mixtures and aggregates at different heights. Near the base, they used heavier aggregate for strength. Near the top, they used lighter materials, even pumice, to reduce weight. The oculus at the top, an open hole, reduced the dome's weight further. Roman architects understood load distribution, arch construction, and engineering principles that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for over 1,000 years after Rome fell. After the fall of Rome, the secret of hydraulic concrete was lost. It wasn't until the 18th century that comparable concrete was developed again. For over a millennium, nobody in Europe could build like the Romans. In 1901, divers recovering artifacts from an ancient shipwreck found a corroded bronze device that turned out to be one of the most sophisticated mechanical objects from the ancient world, the Antikythera mechanism. This device, dated to around 100 BCE, is an analog computer used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses. It has at least 30 bronze gears in a wooden frame, with Greek inscriptions covering the exterior. By turning a crank, you could move the gears, which would show the positions of the sun, moon, and probably the 5 visible planets on various dials. It could predict eclipses years in advance. It tracked the ancient Olympics' 4-year cycle. It accounted for the irregular motion of the moon. The level of miniaturization and precision is extraordinary. Some gears have teeth less than a millimeter long. The mechanical astronomy calculations are sophisticated, incorporating knowledge we don't see documented elsewhere until much later. Nothing like it appears in historical records until medieval astronomical clocks over 1,000 years later. We have no idea how common such devices were. Was this unique? Were there others? If Greeks could build this in 100 BCE, what else could they build? The Antikythera mechanism suggests a level of technological sophistication that's startling. It implies there were instrument makers with extraordinary skill, users who understood complex astronomy, and a market for such devices. It's a reminder that technological progress isn't linear. Capabilities can be lost. The Greeks who built this device knew things that were forgotten, not to be rediscovered for over a millennium. China gave the world several inventions that fundamentally changed human civilization. Paper was invented in China around 100 CE. Before paper, people wrote on papyrus, parchment, bamboo strips, or silk, all expensive or cumbersome. Paper made from plant fibers was cheap, light, and practical. The invention spread slowly westward, reaching the Islamic world around 750 CE and Europe around 1200 CE. For 1,000 years, China had a significant advantage in record-keeping, literacy, and bureaucratic administration because of paper. Printing with wooden blocks came next. By the 7th century CE, Chinese craftsmen were carving text in relief on wooden blocks, inking them, and printing multiple copies. This made books more accessible, though still expensive due to the labor of carving blocks. Movable type, individual characters that could be arranged and rearranged, was invented in China around 1040 CE by Bai Sheng. He used ceramic type. Later versions used wood or metal. However, movable type was less revolutionary in China than it would be in Europe because Chinese has thousands of characters. Organizing and using thousands of individual type pieces was cumbersome. In Europe, with alphabets of about 26 letters, movable type was transformative. Gunpowder was discovered by Chinese alchemists, probably in the 9th century CE, while searching for elixirs of immortality. The irony of discovering humanity's most destructive military technology while seeking eternal life is profound. Early uses were mostly for fireworks and signals. Military applications developed, gradually, fire lances, primitive flamethrowers, bombs, eventually firearms and cannons. By the time gunpowder reached Europe in the 13th century, it would revolutionize warfare completely. These three inventions, paper, printing, and gunpowder, are sometimes called the four great inventions of China, with the magnetic compass being the fourth. Together, they shaped the modern world. The Library of Alexandria, founded around 300 BCE, was the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. At its height, it may have contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of ancient civilizations. Scholars came from across the Mediterranean to study there. Euclid wrote his Elements at Alexandria, systematizing geometry in a way that's still taught today. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Archimedes visited and studied there. Hero of Alexandria invented early steam engines and automated devices. But the library was destroyed, not in a single catastrophic fire as popular imagination often assumes, but gradually through multiple incidents over centuries. Fires, wars, religious purges, and simple neglect all contributed. With the library went irreplaceable works. We know about many lost books only from references in surviving texts. Entire plays by Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides. We have 7 of Sophocles' plays, but he wrote over 120. Scientific treatises, historical accounts, poetry, philosophy, most of ancient literature is lost. Sometimes we're lucky. A medieval monk copies an ancient text, preserving it. Charred scrolls from Herculaneum might be readable with modern technology. Occasionally, someone quotes a lost work at length, preserving fragments. But most is gone forever. We can only imagine what knowledge disappeared. What scientific insights? What engineering techniques? What literature and philosophy? The loss of the Library of Alexandria is a reminder that knowledge is fragile. It must be actively preserved, copied, passed down. Without effort, everything can be lost. And so, after more than 3 hours together, we've completed our immersive journey through the ancient world. We've experienced love and courtship across 7 civilizations, walked the streets of ancient Rome, discovered bizarre jobs that somehow existed, enjoyed ancient entertainment and sports, learned how ancient medicine worked, explored the food and dining customs, traveled ancient roads and trade routes, witnessed how ancient warfare was conducted, understood ancient religious beliefs and practices, and marveled at technological innovations that were far ahead of their time. What emerges from all these stories is a portrait of humanity that's both remarkably different and fundamentally the same. The surface details vary wildly: customs, beliefs, technologies, social structures. But underneath, we find the same human experiences we know today. Ancient people fell in love and built families. They worked at jobs to support themselves, some ordinary, some bizarre. They sought entertainment and leisure. They got sick and sought healing. They shared meals and built communities around food. They traveled to explore and trade. They fought wars and made peace. They sought meaning through religion and spirituality. They invented and innovated, solving problems with ingenuity and creativity. A Roman mother worried about her children's future. A Chinese scholar stayed up late studying by lamplight. An Egyptian craftsman took pride in his work. A Viking sailor navigated by the stars, far from home. A Greek philosopher questioned everything. All of them were human, experiencing life with the same hopes, fears, joys, and sorrows we know. You are connected to these ancient people through an unbroken chain of humanity stretching back thousands of years. Their lives mattered. Their choices shaped the world you inherited. And your life matters too. You're part of that same ongoing story, contributing your own chapter to human history. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine all those countless humans across the ages, each one living their unique life, each one part of the great human story, each one connected to you. Sleep well, knowing you're part of something ancient and ongoing, something that connects us all across time and space, the simple fact of being human. Good night, and thank you for spending this time with me, exploring the fascinating world of history. Sweet dreams. And so we've completed our extended journey through ancient history together. Over 2.5 hours, we've explored love and courtship across 7 civilizations, experienced daily life in ancient Rome, discovered the strangest jobs humans have performed, seen how ancient people entertain themselves, learned about their medical practices, explored their food and dining customs, and traveled the routes they took to explore their world. What emerges from all these stories is a picture of humanity that's both foreign and familiar. The details change dramatically across time and culture, the customs, the beliefs, the technologies. But underneath, the fundamental human experiences remain constant. Ancient people fell in love, worried about their relationships, and tried to build partnerships that would last. They worked at jobs both ordinary and bizarre to support themselves and their families. They sought entertainment and leisure, finding ways to play and compete and celebrate together. They got sick and sought healing, developing medical knowledge through observation and trial. They prepared and shared food, creating social bonds around meals. And they traveled, exploring their world with courage and curiosity despite tremendous obstacles. 3,000 years ago, someone woke up in an ancient city, went about their day working and socializing, ate meals with family, and went to sleep hoping tomorrow would be good. That's not so different from what you did today. We're all part of the same human story, separated only by time. The next time you think about how different the ancient world was, remember that beneath those differences, ancient people were just people, trying to live good lives, form meaningful connections, and leave something behind that would matter. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine all those countless humans across millennia, each living their own unique life, each contributing to the great flow of human history that connects them to you. You're part of that same story, that same human journey through time. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time for another journey through the fascinating, strange, and ultimately very human world of history. Good night.